You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 14th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio.
US President Joe Biden gets the election year China bashing formally underway. US President Joe Biden's rival for the job endures the testimony of his former lawyer, and the new hot ticket for daredevil rail travel nerds. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Patricia Cohen and Quentin Peel will discuss today's big stories, and we'll meet the performance artist who has been dressing up as a giant orange worm. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Patricia Cohen, the global economics correspondent at the New York Times, and by Quentin Peel, associate fellow with the Europe programme at Chatham House. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Greetings.
Quentin, you have been travelling by rail, and we will be talking about travelling by rail later in the show. You've been travelling to Inverness, which is not that exciting in and of itself. Delightful, though I'm sure Inverness is in many respects. It's exciting for me, and I think to our listeners, to speak to hear from somebody who has travelled by rail in Britain and actually got to where they wanted to go.
Indeed, but it's a lovely railway line. It goes all along the Northumberland coast, which is wonderful, and then to Edinburgh, and then all along through the Scottish Highlands. So it's a fantastic journey.
But did it actually leave on time and not stop for 7 hours because there was a cow on the line somewhere near Barrow-in-Furness?
It did absolutely that. We were about
amazing
2 minutes late when we got there.
Extraordinary. The things you hear. Patricia, you have been visiting New York City, also congruent to what we will be discussing later in the show, because we will be talking about things occurring at a certain Manhattan courthouse. How was New York? Did you go down there to see the show at all?
I did not go down to see that show. It actually hadn't started yet when I was down there. But
otherwise, you'd have been right out the front with your placard and your MAGA hat.
Yes. Well, I used to cover many years ago. I covered the federal courts down there, so I'm quite familiar with that courthouse. And I always think, covering the courts, you see everything. Lust, fight, greed, ambition. It's
and now they've got one
great.
Court case with all of that.
With all of those things, everything you could imagine.
And was it freezing when you used to cover it, just like Mr. Trump complains of?
It wasn't freezing, but there were definitely mice and other, unmentionables there.
Well, he hasn't complained about the mice yet. We probably have that to look forward to. But we will start elsewhere in the United States, a country in which it is difficult to imagine that you can lose votes by beating up on China. Accordingly, President Joe Biden has announced thumping hikes on tariffs on certain Chinese imports, notably a doubling of tariffs on solar cells, a tripling of tariffs on some steel and aluminium products. Note aluminium, it's not aluminum, it's definitely aluminium, and a quadrupling of tariffs on Chinese electric cars, which will now be taxed at the eye-catching, if not eye-watering rate of 100%. The official line is that these measures are to protect American jobs and innovation from predatory and or otherwise unfair Chinese practices. Patricia, first of all, obviously everybody in the administration says, no, this has nothing at all to do with the election, perish the thought, etc. No domestic political considerations have gone into the manufacturing of these tariffs. That's obviously nonsense, but is there actually a non-electioneering case for any of this?
I mean, it's interesting. The EU as well has been looking at whether there's an investigation going on whether China has been dumping electric vehicles, and certainly there has been incredible overcapacity. And as I understand it, there's thousands and thousands of electric vehicles that have been just kind of piling up at ports for the last 2 years because they don't have buyers for them yet. So, on the one hand, yes, it's true. The other hand, though, this particular tariff on electric vehicles is not going to be very much different than what was in effect under Trump. So even though it sounds very eye-catching, oh my goodness, 100%, it's not that much in that case.
That is literally something Trump threatened to do.
Exactly, and the kind of tariffs that he had put into effect, which Biden, by the way, had run against in 2020 and said he would repeal, those, temporarily have done that. I mean, I have a question, which I'm curious. If the U.S. had, and obviously China has done a lot of has stolen intellectual property and it's an authoritarian government. But if the EU and the West and the U.S. had invested incredibly in electric vehicles and solar panels and then wanted to kind of export all of this to the rest of the world, I'm wondering, would everybody be outraged that we were flooding their markets, or would we be thanking them that we're doing so much for climate change?
Quentin, is this another increment in the rolling back of globalization? It is, I think, often forgotten because he is setting himself up, or has been set up, in opposition to Donald Trump of all people, that Joe Biden is quite the America First protectionist, on his own merits, isn't he?
Yeah, I think just in recent times, The Economist has run an issue saying end of globalization is with us. And I think in a way it is. Mind, this is, I think, overwhelmingly political, as you said in the introduction. I love the quote that was in the Financial Times today from a senior US official saying, this is not political.
Not perish the thought.
Given that, as you say, Donald Trump has threatened to put 100% tariffs on every single Chinese vehicle, it clearly is Biden protecting his back and not wanting to lose votes in some rather crucial swing states. So the trouble is, there almost certainly is going to be some sort of Chinese response. And secondly, I think the Europeans will be quite tempted to try and do something similar for fear that excess production from China of electric vehicles doesn't all swamp the European market, which would be the obvious alternative.
Patricia, the tariff on Chinese electric vehicles is especially theatrical. They are more or less priced out of America's market anyway. It's practically impossible to buy a Chinese electric car in the United States, even if you wanted to. Nevertheless, does this work, or does Biden think this is going to work? Because in the United States, there is still something especially visceral attached to the automobile industry. I think people, when they think of a metaphor for American decline, they think of the gutting of Detroit, which was substantially due to the fact that the Japanese built better and cheaper cars.
Definitely there is a kind of romance with the American car, and that industry has certainly loomed much larger in the imagination, perhaps, than in reality. Most people don't realize that manufacturing at this point makes up about 11% of the U.S. economy, which is not that much, really, although it's important. Also, I think the steel and aluminum tariffs are important because that I think is very directed at particularly swing states that Biden is worried about losing, and I think that's definitely focused on votes there. I will say the Biden administration has gone out of its way to point out the differences with the Trump tariffs, which Biden is saying it's much more focused on these kind of high-tech industries and climate-related industries that the U.S. is now funneling billions of dollars into in terms of to jumpstart.
Quentin, as a general rule, is there actually anything wrong with tariffs? I know that circa the end of the Cold War throughout the 90s, early 21st century, everybody was terribly excited about free trade and globalization. But is there anything wrong as a general principle with the government of a country saying our first responsibility is to the industries and thereby the employees of this country?
I think if they're at a reasonable level, that probably is a defensible position to say, but 100% tariff strikes me as being a little bit in the realm of the unreasonable.
Even if, though, and this is the accusation made against China, they are deliberately, well, not necessarily deliberately, they're able to build stuff incredibly cheaply because they don't have the same stringent manufacturing standards or labour practices that Western countries do.
Yes, possibly, but they've also been strategically very quick and to get into that market faster than anybody else, and actually to produce pretty good and reliable cars. I believe my daughter has bought a Chinese electric vehicle recently and swears by it and says it's absolutely wonderful. So I think that I'm a little bit confused by this whole business. Which way does Biden want to have the US-China relationship? Literally, today it's reported that they've agreed they're going to have much closer cooperation on environmental policy and so on. Well, hey, what are electric vehicles except a contribution to environmental policy?
Just finally on that, Patricia, and picking up on the enthusiastic endorsement of Quentin's daughter for a Chinese-built electric car. I mean, it's clear that electric cars are the future of automobiles. The petrol engine is it's a declining thing. We're not far away probably from the point at which there won't be any new petrol engine cars built. Obviously, the company or the country that gets out in front of electric cars is going to do wonderfully well. Are we seeing here as well, apart from the domestic electioneering, the United States being a bit fearful that China could do to American electric cars what Japan did to the petrol-powered ones?
Oh, absolutely. And that was actually the point that I perhaps did not clearly enough make my first comment, which is, the reason that China now has this industry is because of enormous subsidies that the government decided to funnel into this industry. Well, now, the U.S. is funneling also enormous subsidies into this. Now, of course, Chinese subsidies always are described as unfair subsidies whenever they're talked about. And it goes back to your question before. What are fair tariffs? What are fair subsidies? What makes sense to do and not? But I mean, this is clearly a result of wanting to protect incipient industry, because as Biden says, the Biden administration says, if we don't, the Chinese will dominate 70 to 90% of the global EV car market.
Well, to New York City, where the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, second in line to the presidency of the United States, has made an appearance in support of a former occupant of that position who attempted to prolong his term via coup d'etat and is now standing trial for cooking the books to include a hush-money payoff to the porn star with whom he cheated on his third wife. Verily, the Republican Party has been on a journey since Eisenhower. The star turned today as yesterday was Trump's former attorney and fixer Michael Cohen, who has turned on the boss, for whom he once swore he'd take a bullet and for whom he did serve 3 years. Quentin, none of this is tremendously dignified, I think it's fair to say. Are you nevertheless finding some way to enjoy the circus?
It is extraordinary theatre. I mean, unfortunately, that's what Trump is very good at and seems to attract this sort of thing. I think in a normal, sane world, the evidence that we've heard would be absolutely devastating to Donald Trump. Having said that, it doesn't seem to be. The US is now so divided in its politics and so deeply angry, I think, that people are agreeing with him that this is all grievously unfair, in spite of the fact that what's coming out is that the sort of people that he had as his closest advisors were pretty dubious people.
Well, several of whom have already ended up in the clink. Patricia, I suspect Quentin may have already partially pre-answered this question with his talk about how divided the United States is. But honestly, what is Speaker Mike Johnson doing? Which is to say, why is he not, if asked, saying, I'm the Speaker of the House of Representatives, this has nothing to do with me. It's not even a federal trial. It is a state trial in New York State. It is the business of New York State. I have other things to be getting on with.
Well, again, it is exactly that point of how divided U.S. politics are, and where the issues and the substance just don't matter at all. And it also speaks to Trump's continuing power within the Republican Party. He is still, even though he doesn't hold any office now, clearly the most influential figure in Republican politics and in the party. And, one might almost wonder whether some of the Republicans who have showed up at the courthouse to speak in his defense are not in a way kind of trying out for, the vice presidency spot, which is still open, and Trump has not chosen someone yet. So it's kind of like an audition to see how much you can ingratiate yourself with Trump. I was really struck on the Times homepage today that under the story about Michael Cohen's trial, there was a poll about how Trump is ahead in kind of 5 key swing states. And it really goes back to 2016 when Trump made this comment at the time, which we all laughed at during the campaign, that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for him. And I think what we now see 8 years later is essentially that's pretty much the case for his supporters.
Further in Speaker Mike Johnson's remarks, Quentin, there was something which was quite difficult to disagree with. He said that Michael Cohen is a known liar who is clearly on a mission for personal revenge. That's going to be that'll be the defence case against Cohen, won't it? And it is the case. He is a convicted fraud. He clearly does have an axe to grind. Is he, despite all that, still able to be positioned as a reliable witness?
Very difficult to say, I think. I mean, he is the key witness in this case. And as I understand it, it'll only take one juror to actually say, I'm not persuaded that Donald Trump is guilty, that he'll get off with it. So I think it's a pretty big one for the prosecution to try and pull off. It is extraordinary, though. I mean, here is a man, Michael Cohen, who lied for the president when he worked for him, who basically bent the rules, who invoiced him for legal expenses, which were, according to him, actually to cover for the hush money that he paid to Stormy Daniels. So the whole thing is really rather sordid, and yet somehow the horror at it doesn't seem to be getting through to Mr. Trump's own supporters.
Well, there's another problem here as well, isn't there, Patricia, that even if he is convicted and even if he is imprisoned, it's not hard to see how that could end up working for him. Indeed, there have been reports today that the Department of Justice is nudging a judge to instruct Steve Bannon to actually begin his 4-month stretch for contempt of Congress. But you can imagine that for Steve Bannon, that's all his Christmas has come at once, isn't it?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is that supporters of Trump are just, have faith in him, and any attempt to kind of get out the truth, or even in a criminal or civil trial, is seen as just a means of persecution by his enemies. And so that's the problem. I think it has less to do with whether Michael Cohen was the most upstanding citizen or not. Trials all the time depend on people who turn about. Think about mafia trials where...
Which this kind of is.
It is. It does. Actually, there was a former prosecutor who made the in New York who made that comparison, and so I think that it goes back to this before. I don't know that there's anybody, if they have their mind made up about Trump, that is going to be persuaded one way or the other.
Well, despite all that apparent argument that the democratic experiment might need some rejigging, in Copenhagen right now, the 7th annual Copenhagen Democracy Summit is underway. The speakers include politicians, officials and activists who are all broadly keen on the furtherance of democracy. But according to the findings of the event's conveners, the Alliance of Democracies, this enthusiasm is, if slightly, decreasingly widely shared. The survey of 63,000 people across 53 countries found that while 85% of people believed democracy was important, only 58% believed it was working out tremendously well where they happen to live, which, Quentin, strikes me as not only inevitable, but actually a statement of what democracy is like. Nobody's going to be happy.
Yeah, I think it nonetheless does show that there is a worrying moment where trust in democracy seems to be really wobbly, and there are one or two things in the poll that I think should be genuinely a cause for concern. Part of it is what you were saying, that not much more than 50% of people actually believe their own countries have a good democratic system, even if they want it. And the other thing that comes through rather strongly is this division of the world into the global north, i.e. what we have traditionally called the West, and the global south, very much sort of driven by Ukraine and driven by what's happening in the Middle East, in Gaza and Israel. So you see that US is identified with democracy, Europe is identified with democracy, but because from a point of view of African countries and so on, they would appear to be on the wrong side in backing what Israel is doing in Gaza, their popularity is going down. So this is what Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who's really the former Secretary General of NATO, who's the guiding light behind this conference, he said it is a very worrying moment. We've got to look to our laurels and prove to people that democracy is a system that works.
Patricia, there was another, what you might broadly term a global north versus global south divide, which struck me in the findings, which almost precisely, it was notable that the more developed and established a democracy a particular country is, the more negative the view of social media, and vice versa in countries which are struggling or have struggled to establish themselves as prosperous, orderly democracies. There is tremendous enthusiasm for social media. What does it tell us that people who live already in broadly functional countries kind of get that social media is terrible and dangerous?
Well, I actually don't find that very surprising. So what you're seeing, and I'll just talk about the U.S. for a moment, what we've seen is how incredibly corrosive and destructive the use of social media, not only people themselves, but also attempts by other countries like Russia and China to use social media in a way to undermine democracy. And unfortunately, that has been played into by Trump and other Republican politicians who've brought the electoral system, questioned it in ways that really are not legitimate and that don't have evidence. So there has been you can see there's evidence of the corrosive effects that this has had on functioning democracies. In a lot of these other countries where either there's authoritarian rule or democracies in name more than in function, social media has served as a kind of, pathway to talk about other people who are perhaps in opposition to the government. And certainly we saw, now going back, whether it was the Arab Spring or other times, where social media was kind of a conduit for people to push for reforms. And so I think it kind of depends where a country is and how that the medium is being used.
Is there a wider danger attached to social media, Quentin, in that for the first time, it is now possible for literally any Yahoo who doesn't need to actually understand anything about anything at all to build an influential following? 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't entirely unheard of for people who had no idea about anything to acquire some sort of following in the media, but there were gatekeepers, there were things you had to get past, people you had to convince, whereas now it's not. And it's much easier, I think, now for people to take the easy option of believing what they want to hear rather than do the work attendant on being a good citizen of democracy, of actually finding anything out and having a bit of a think about things.
Well, I share that view, but having said that, it is interesting to look at those countries which were very positive about social media. So Nigeria was top. Nigeria, most of the time, well, half the time is a democracy and half the time seems to have a military government. And then Indonesia was another one that was high on the list. There, I think people are seeing the social media as, if you like, opening the door for them to be able to participate in a process which hitherto they've felt quite excluded from and very much not part of the elite.
Fair enough.
There is a wonderful test case about to come up, one that I'm quite concerned about. I mean, if we look at the date, we are 30 years since that extraordinary election in South Africa, where, do you remember, it was the first majority rule election with Nelson Mandela running at the head of the ANC list, and there were queues at all the polling stations as the people of South Africa said, we want this democracy. Well, they've got another election coming up in about 2 weeks' time, and there's a real worry that turnout will be down, that people will be disaffected. There are populists running who are running on rather racist, nationalist agendas, and it's definitely deteriorated somewhat.
I did want to close this portion of the discussion on a constructive note and ask you each in turn. You first, Patricia. Is there one particular reform you would enact to underpin the furtherance of democracy? Regular listeners they will already have guessed what my response is going to be. The compulsory vote, as we have in Australia, big fan of that, plus the sausage on election day, vegetarian options also available.
Well, this may sound very self-serving, but it goes to the point before where you made about being able to really distinguish true information from falsehood. And it's not only that I think people are lazy, it's also getting increasingly difficult to actually discern what is true and what is misinformation or disinformation. And so one thing, and this is, again, maybe more relevant to the United States, but they're basically local media, local journalism outlets have essentially been dying off for years. It's just not a economic model that works anymore. And if you don't have a local media, a newspaper, a daily newspaper, looking at what the mayor's doing, the city council is doing, the head of the fire department or the police department or any other businesses, you're going to have more corruption. And so I do think, and again, I know this sounds self-serving, but an independent media, particularly in local in local places, would really help democracy.
Quentin, what about you? Do you support, for example, restricting the franchise to men of a certain age whose first name begins with Q?
No, certainly not. No, what I think is absolutely essential is a much more transparent system of political financing, or indeed something like what they do in Germany of actually having public financing of political parties and having a much more restricted system of private financing, because I think that, one of the things that is seen to undermine democracy as number 3, I think, in the list is global corporations, the idea that the rich can buy results. And that is very destructive.
Well, let's move along. And in recent years, for obvious reasons, Russia has rather descended the ranks of most touristed countries. North Korea never really climbed up them beyond a few package tours catering for people who are really into looking at posters of folks in overalls gazing nobly into the middle distance. However, a new or rather revived rail link may prove tempting in the event that the necessary visas can be wrangled. After a COVID-induced hiatus, trains are set to roll again from Vladivostok via Kazan, just inside the Russian border, to the North Korean city of Rason, all of which is almost certainly quicker, cheaper and less complicated than attempting to get from Euston to Northampton. Quentin, first of all, you actually do have some experience of having travelled by rail in this neck of the woods.
I did. Must have been about 1989, I think, when Gorbachev was running the Soviet Union. I took a train from Khabarovsk, which is already quite a long way towards the Soviet Far East, to a little port called Nakhodka. And this was a journalist trip on which was one North Korean journalist. He was very restrained.
Life and soul of the party, he wasn't?
He wasn't, no. He wore a little button in his lapel for Mr. Kim Il-sung.
Which was diligently beaming all your conversations back to head office.
No doubt. But he read the entire way there, and it was only afterwards that I discovered that what he was reading was a Russian-Korean dictionary.
So by by implication, Quentin, we learn that the conversation of you and your fellow hacks was less absorbing than reading a Russian-Korean dictionary.
Well, presumably. I think it was just his defence, so he didn't have to say anything. But it was an extraordinary... I mean, it was a 17-hour journey that I took just for the very last bit of that journey, and I suddenly realised what an extraordinary, distance one had to travel to get anywhere. But we were right there on the borders of North Korea and China, and you looked round in what was then called the Soviet Far East, and it was totally white. There were no Asian faces around. It was really quite remarkable, and you realised that Siberia is actually the largest Russian colony. It's a colony.
And it is absolutely vast, as I can attest myself, having done the rail trip across that from Moscow to Beijing via Ulaanbaatar about 20 years ago. You really do, well, it's a thing you've kind of got your head around, Patricia, before you go that, wow, Russia's really big. And this is an Australian talking. But when we look at this particular trip, Patricia, are you tempted?
Well, I would be tempted just because... First of all, I would love to go to North Korea, and
so would I. I'm actually quite into the posters of folks in overalls staring into the middle distance.
Well, I was in Seoul for the first time, actually, earlier, and you can go to the demilitarized zone and kind of look over, and they have these, with telescopes or whatever, where you can look over into North Korea and across it. And actually, the thing that was so striking is just that there's been this kind of border and ongoing state of war now for 70 years. And it's really kind of amazing. We were talking before about how kind of the world is so globalized, and yet there are these kind of patches of it that are still so closed off. So yes, I would be tempted just to go someplace I've never been and would be very hard to see.
Well, we can all start applying for our visas imminently. Patricia Cohen and Quentin Peel, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, on March 23rd, roughly 1,000 people queued for hours at Seattle's Asian Art Museum for a chance to meet the Buddhist bug, a bright orange creature inhabited by Unida Uale. The Cambodian-American performance artist is the subject of an exhibition at the museum until July 7th that documents her eye-catching costumed personae, which tackle religious and political themes. A few weeks after Ali's performance, Monocle's Gregory Scruggs met the artist in the gallery space. He began by asking her, not unreasonably, to explain these unique creations.
Yes, what's so, I think, special about this exhibition, Hybrid Skin, Mythical Presence, is it puts into conversation two of my very epic works, The Buddhist Bug and The Red Chador. Both are serial works that take up many, many years of work and of the narrative itself for each of the personas to bloom and flourish and cultivate into a series of stories. The Buddhist bug measures about 100 meters long, or about a little under 350 feet, and is a tubular orange sculpture made of fabric and plastic tubing inside, and it winds across different spaces through walls and across ceilings and onto the floor and undulates, and it's a pretty big project of mine that spans from 2009 until 2015. The Red Chador series is a pretty difficult story to tell within this exhibition space because she was birthed in 2015. Then the garment disappeared in 2017 in Tel Aviv, Israel. And then it was rebirthed in 2019, just before the pandemic arrived in the USA. And that rebirth is called the Red Chador Genesis 1, and that came out of Honolulu. And since the pandemic, the Red Chador has been rebirthed around the world as a colorful entourage of a total of 7 people who embody the Chador garments. They are people I call the Chadoras, and it includes the red sequin garment of the Red Chador itself, which is the one that I always wear, and then there are 6 other rainbow-colored sequin Chadors in orange, gold, green, blue, purple, and fuchsia. And this collective is sort of a new development in the work in which there's local participation from interested folks who want to stand in solidarity to the issues that the Red Chador series brings up, which is really addressing a global Islamophobia.
For the uninitiated, what exactly is a chador, and how and by whom is it worn?
The chador is a word that refers to a garment that is identified in most Muslim-majority countries as a covering. My chador is one in which I also wear a full veil, which is also called a niqab, that covers the woman's face. And I use the word chador because I think that in mainstream media and on a global level, it is a word that is easily identifiable in terms of addressing garments that are worn by some Muslim women. But in my own tradition, as someone who is ethnically mixed, because in fact I am Cambodian, I am Cham, I am Malay, and I am Thai, and in my upbringing as a Muslim woman and as a Muslim child, we used to wear something called the telekung, which is a Malay term for our prayer garment, which covers us. But I know that the world doesn't really know the word telekung as much as the chador, and thus my project is named after that. Words are very important for me, and most of my titles, they're kind of clever, and they are also puns because I come from a history of poetry and writing with some of my earlier works.
Take us back to the birth of the Red Chador. Who commissioned the work, and what was the impetus for creating this persona at that particular moment in time?
The birth of the work began in 2015 as a commission for the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, which is one of the premier contemporary art spaces. For the show Archipelago, it was focusing on Southeast Asian artists, and there was a lot of space given to performance artists. Certain people, once they think that what they're seeing is a Muslim body, gets alarmed and gets uptight and decides that this is a problem, and they start to get nervous. And I've seen this where people literally shake in my presence as the Red Chador. I didn't think that people would see such an alarming image, especially with something this shiny and fabulous. That's not the reaction that I get with the work. Now, there are a ton of lovely encounters, people who do receive the different gestures that I offer. My gestures are the heart shake, which is where I put two of my hands at my heart, and then I deliver that heart out to people with this gesture that goes out. And people see that and they'll receive it. They'll imitate me by doing the same. And then sometimes I will just bow to them as the Red Chador, just completely humble myself and offer a bow. I would say in the Western context, in the European context, that's not done enough of because people rely, I believe, on the handshake. This gesture is done in a lot of Asian societies, right? And it is a moment of humbling and offering a moment of humility to one another, a moment of reverence. And that is always very well received. And that also sort of disarms a moment too, when they see that, no, I'm offering you a moment of reverence and a peaceful gesture. And the other thing I have done is when people allow me to approach them, I'll offer my hand, and then they'll know, some of them, to offer their hand, or I'll gesture. All of this is done in silence, and they'll put their hand on mine, and some of them are shaking, right? So I know this person, for some reason, is scared, we can assume that they're either scared because they're reading a very politicized image onto me as the performer, or maybe they have not had the experience of performance art, or maybe it's both. And so oftentimes when they're shaking, I just hold their hand and I caress it with the other hand on top. And sometimes in Washington, D.C., I had a woman who was very much nervous, and it was anxiety-filled, and she came with her daughter, an older daughter, and she was very hesitant to approach me, but I had beckoned them forward. And this is the piece where the red chador is in the middle of 99 U.S. flags. And there are 99 other shorter white flags that have the word salam silk screened on it. And salam means peace, and it's also the name of our religion. Islam comes from the word peace. So I hold her hand. This older woman is shaking. I take her hand, I pull it in. I have her touch my heart, then I have her touch my neck, and then I have her deveil me. And then I smile at her. And she totally softens and she says, "That wasn't so bad."
Thanks to Gregory Scruggs in Seattle for that report. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Patricia Cohen and Quentin Peel. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Tamsin Howard. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.